She had no PhD, no research grant, no formal training, just a borrowed suit, a clipboard full of notes no one asked for, and a heart that never stopped observing. 15 top scientists funded by millions, praised by the media, failed to solve a crucial energy model. But a temporary secretary, who was only there to serve coffee, fixed it with one handwritten correction. Who was she? Why did she disappear the moment success came knocking? And why did the man who built a tech empire on logic choose to rewrite everything just to walk beside her? This isn't a love story, not in the way you think. It's a story about recognition, about brilliance that blooms in silence, about a woman who never asked to be seen but changed everything when someone finally did. If this story touches something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. 15 brilliant minds, each with more letters behind their names than Emma had dollars in her bank account. And yet, they couldn't solve it. The air inside the glass conference room was stiff with tension and recycled air, the kind that tasted metallic on the tongue. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly above the long, polished oak table, reflecting the glow of multiple screens filled with simulations, graphs, and models. It was supposed to be a final run through a pre-launch check before the investors were flown in from New York and Tokyo. But something wasn't working. Again, Emma Whitaker, holding a tray with 2 coffees, lingered at the edge of the room, careful not to make eye contact, careful to breathe without being noticed. Her badge read Administrative Temp, though no one had ever bothered to look that closely. She knew which mug belonged to Dr. Russo Cream, no sugar, and which one Cole Bennett preferred black. Always. She also knew that the simulation had failed for the 3rd time in 2 days. The whiteboards were cluttered with equations, the kind that once made her heart race in college lecture halls, back when she still thought she could belong in places like this. Now she stood on the periphery, half forgotten, invisible in her quietness. The lead engineer, a stern woman named Dr. Kim, leaned forward, her voice tight. If the temperature spike at phase 3 continues, the energy loop destabilizes and it doesn't make sense. Another man interrupted. The numbers are right. We've run them a dozen times. Cole, standing at the far end of the room, arms crossed, said nothing. His jaw was clenched, as if holding back the storm behind his silence. Emma set the tray on the sideboard, then paused. Her eyes scanned the screen one more time, just long enough to feel it. Something off. The simulation showed a sudden drop at 212 degrees. It plateaued, then spiked. There was a flicker in her mind, something old and half forgotten from her early physics classes. It shouldn't plateau there, not unless... She swallowed. Then, for reasons even she wouldn't understand later, she spoke. Is the temperature input in Fahrenheit or Celsius? The words fell into the room like an accidental chime. The arguing stopped, heads turned, some with frowns, others in confusion. Emma stood completely still, hands clasped in front of her, heart pounding. Doctor, Kim blinked. Excuse me. Emma cleared her throat. It's just, at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, water boils. But if your algorithm is set to metric, 212 would be well beyond boiling. The spike could be due to a conversion mismatch. There was a silence, the kind that stretches longer than it should. One of the junior engineers typed something quickly, eyes darting. Another stood, leaned closer to the screen. Oh my God, someone muttered. Wait, she's right. Dr. Russo leaned back slowly in his chair, eyes not on the screen, but on Emma. The unit default in the last system update. We didn't switch it back to Celsius. The buzz around the table grew louder, now tinged with embarrassment, shock, the kind of collective shame that ripples through people who should have known better. Then came the voice that silenced all others. And who exactly are you again? Cole Bennett's tone wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. His voice was ice-controlled, clipped, with the kind of authority that rarely had to repeat itself. Emma turned to face him fully. His eyes were gray, unreadable, sharp as glass. She held her ground, though she felt the weight of the room pressing down on her spine. "I'm just the temp," she said softly. Cole said nothing. His gaze remained fixed, unreadable. He didn't nod, didn't blink, just watched her like a puzzle that didn't quite fit the box it came in. "Doctor." Kim leaned over and began rerunning the simulation with the corrected input. Within seconds, the loop stabilized. The model held. Energy levels plateaued exactly where they were supposed to. Someone let out a long breath. Another clapped softly in disbelief. Emma took a step back, unsure whether to leave or wait. No one addressed her again. They just went on with their work, slightly more subdued, slightly more aware that the room wasn't as closed off as they thought. She picked up the now empty tray, careful not to drop the spoons. Her cheeks burned, not with pride, but with the discomfort of being seen too clearly by people who didn't expect her to exist at that level. As she walked out, she could feel Cole's eyes on her back. She didn't look over her shoulder, but she didn't have to. It wasn't the look of curiosity or respect. It wasn't disdain, either. It was something far more unsettling. It was attention. She stepped back into the hallway, the hum of fluorescent lights following her like a shadow. The conference room door clicked shut behind her, and Cole Bennett kept staring at the door long after she was gone, before she was the woman who solved the unsolvable. She was just the woman who folded her mother's laundry and worried about rent. Milesburg. Montana didn't show up on most maps unless you knew exactly where to look. It was the kind of town where porch swings creaked in rhythm with the wind, and the sound of gravel beneath tires told you who was coming down the road. Life there wasn't grand. It was worn, familiar, and quiet in the way only small towns can be. Emma Whitaker lived in a single-story house with peeling white paint and a wind chime that never quite stayed in tune. The air inside always carried a faint trace of lavender ointment and the slow hiss of an oxygen machine humming from the living room. Her mother's cough had grown worse over the years, chronic, stubborn, and as much a part of their mornings as coffee and pills. Most of Emma's days started the same. She would rise before the sun, pad barefoot to the kitchen, and turn on the percolator. Then she'd move slowly through the house, folding warm laundry from the dryer, checking her mother's oxygen tank, making toast with too much butter because that's how her mother liked it, all while pretending she wasn't counting the money in her head again. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Emma had believed in more. At 21, she was a physics major with a scholarship and a vision board taped above her dorm bed. But dreams cost money, and marriage came quickly after her father died. It was meant to be stability, a fresh start. Instead, it became a chain she wore for 6 years until it broke with finality divorce papers and a worn-out suitcase. She never went back to school. That Monday had started like all the others. The grocery list sat on the fridge next to a reminder for a doctor's appointment. But at the corner pharmacy where she picked up inhalers and compression socks, there was a tattered flyer, thumbtacked near the cashier, temporary administrative position. Bennett Energy Solutions, Seattle, travel and housing included. It wasn't the kind of thing Emma usually noticed. She never looked for jobs outside Montana. Who would care for her mother? How would she even get there? But that day, something in her paused. The flyer looked like it had been there a while. The ink faded, a corner curling like it had given up waiting. She asked the pharmacist if she could take it. He nodded, didn't even look up from the register. That night, after her mother had fallen asleep during reruns of old crime dramas, Emma sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, borrowed from the church lending library. The job listing was still open. It asked for basic clerical skills, attention to detail, and ability to maintain confidentiality in a high-level scientific environment. She didn't lie on the application, didn't embellish. She simply wrote, experience in medical office support. Studied physics for 2.5 years at community college. Excellent memory for systems and patterns. Then, with no expectations and less hope, she clicked submit. For 2 days, she heard nothing. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon, while scrubbing baseboards in the hallway, her phone rang with a Seattle area code. A woman's voice on the other end sounded flustered, rushed. There's been a cancellation. Are you available to start next week? Travel covered. Short-term contract 6 weeks. Emma said yes before she could talk herself out of it. It wasn't until after she hung up that her hands started shaking. She looked down and realized she'd dropped the sponge on the floor. The suitcase she pulled from the closet still had the tag from her last trip, her honeymoon, nearly a decade ago. She packed light 2 pairs of jeans, a few sweaters, and her old physics notebook. Not because she thought she'd need it, but because it felt like a piece of herself she hadn't carried in years. Her mother didn't protest, didn't scold or plead. She simply nodded and said, "You come back. All right. No matter what happens." At the Greyhound station, the air smelled of diesel and hot pretzels. She clutched her ticket like it might disappear. The bus pulled in with a loud exhale, its sides streaked with the memory of a dozen different states. Emma took the window seat and let her bag sit on her lap, arms wrapped around it like armor. As the town disappeared behind them, she kept her eyes on the horizon, not because she expected to find anything there, but because the rear view hurt more. She didn't know what waited in Seattle, didn't know about the glass-walled conference room, or the coffee orders, or the man with the silver watch who would one day ask her who she thought she was. She only knew she had $823 in her account, a notebook full of formulas, and a mother waiting for oxygen refills. That had to be enough. The bus rumbled into the night, lights blinking in rhythm with the long stretches of road. Emma leaned her head against the window and watched the moon follow them west. She didn't know where this road would take her. She only knew she had to go. Her desk sat right outside the glass conference room, close enough to hear their brilliance, far enough to never be invited in. The floor plan of Bennett Energy Solutions was open and pristine, designed with glass and light to make everything feel transparent and forward-thinking. But Emma quickly learned that not all walls were made of drywall. Some were made of silence, of credentials, of invisible badges that told you who got to speak and who only got to listen. Her desk was tucked into a narrow corner between the elevators and the executive suite, directly outside the room where the scientists held their briefings. From there, she could hear muffled phrases about isotopes and magnetic field failures, discussions so complex they seemed more like music than language. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. Her first week was a whirlwind of passwords, spreadsheets, and protocols. The company intranet was a maze of acronyms. She took notes on everything: the coffee orders, the way Cole Bennett always showed up precisely 7 minutes late to the Monday briefings, and how no one ever corrected Dr. Russo even when he was wrong, which was rare. Emma kept her head down. She arrived early, left late, and made no effort to insert herself. She answered phones with warmth, organized travel itineraries, double-checked lab shipments. She was invisible by design, and she knew how to be good at that. Cole Bennett passed by her desk 3 times before he spoke to her. The first time, he didn't look at her at all, just walked by with the kind of presence that drew glances without demanding them. The second time, he paused briefly, glanced at the nameplate she'd typed herself and taped to the desk corner, then gave a faint nod. The third time, he handed her a folder without a word. She opened it to find a lab roster with a sticky note that read, in sharp block letters, alphabetize this by title, not name. It wasn't cruel. It was cold, clinical, efficient. And yet, in some strange way, Emma appreciated the clarity. She had heard the whispers about him: Harvard at 19, first patent at 24, a lab explosion that took his wife and left him with a permanent crease between his brows. He was the kind of man who didn't suffer fools and rarely repeated himself. Emma didn't blame him for that. She admired him, but she also knew her place. Once, during a morning break, she passed the conference room and saw them all seated in a semicircle, arguing over data models. She stood just far enough away to not be seen. For a brief moment, she allowed herself the thought, what if I had finished my degree? Then she tucked the idea away like a loose thread in a sweater. Better not to pull. On her third Thursday there, something happened. A young researcher, Reed. She thought his name was rushed down the hallway with a thick folder of printed data. Too many pages to hold properly. As he turned the corner, A few sheets slipped free and scattered across the floor. Emma knelt instinctively, collecting the pages before they could be trampled. Her eyes flicked across the top sheet as she aligned the corners. It was a temperature regulation report. The data columns caught her attention, not because she sought them out, but because they were familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten. There, line 17, a notation. Phase shift at 98.6 degrees, but the graph showed a deviation closer to 37 Celsius body temperature. Not the same. She stared for half a second too long. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stacked the last of the papers. Reed was already doubling back, cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Thanks," he said quickly, not quite meeting her eyes. Emma nodded, stood, and returned the folder silently. Her heart beat fast, not from the interaction, but from what she hadn't said. She had seen an error, not obvious, but not small either. A unit mismatch. Again. The same type of mistake that had tanked the simulation earlier that week. She should have said something, or written a note, or quietly flagged it to someone who might actually listen. But instead, she walked back to her desk, sat down slowly, and stared at the blinking cursor on her screen. She told herself, "It's not your place." Then, "What if you're wrong?" And finally, even if you're right, who would care? From the corner of her eye, she noticed Dr. Matteo Russo standing near the water cooler. He wasn't looking at Reed. He was watching her. Their eyes met, only for a second. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just noticed. And for someone used to being invisible, that was almost too much. Emma returned to her screen. A spreadsheet blinked open. She typed a note about a supply order that no one would remember. But her hands moved a little slower than usual, and her thoughts didn't stay where they were supposed to. Outside, the rain had started again, pattering softly against the tall windows of the building that never slept. All it took was one handwritten correction, and the whole simulation ran like magic. Emma didn't sleep much the night after the meeting. Her mind replayed every second, every face turning in her direction, the sharp snap of silence after she spoke, and the cold steel in Cole Bennett's voice. She had tried to bury it, to file it away as just another strange day, but the way he looked at her, that didn't fade. The next morning, the email came at 7:03 a.m., subject, "Please step into my office," from C. Bennett. No greeting, no punctuation beyond what was necessary. Emma stared at the message for almost a full minute before standing. As she made her way down the corridor, past glass walls and polished marble, she braced for it. This was the kind of thing that didn't happen to people like her. Speaking out. Correcting high-level scientists. That wasn't bold, it was foolish. She imagined herself packing her bag before noon, returning to Montana on a Greyhound with one less paycheck and 1,000 more regrets. Cole's office was large, but not excessive. Clean lines, high windows, no family photos, a desk too tidy to be lived in, a chair turned just slightly off-center as if its owner never fully sat still. He didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he placed a printed model on the table between them. The same failed simulation she had seen before. But now, one corner of it was circled in red pen. "What did you see?" he asked, voice low, unreadable. Emma hesitated, unsure how to answer. She hadn't expected a question. She'd expected a warning, a dismissal, maybe even condescension. But curiosity, that was unfamiliar. "I noticed the temperature plateau," she said carefully. It didn't match the expected phase shift. It reminded me of something from an old lab exercise. When we mixed units Celsius and Fahrenheit, nothing lined up. It caused thermal discrepancies that looked exactly like that. Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "I thought maybe it was something like that. Just a conversion issue, a detail overlooked." Cole stared at the model, then back at her. He didn't blink much, didn't nod. He simply said, "Thank you." That was it. No follow-up, no interrogation, no expression at all. Emma turned and walked back to her desk with a pulse quickened not by fear, but by the discomfort of having been heard. By noon. Whispers were already circulating through the lab halls. No one said her name out loud, but something had shifted. The tone of the staff had changed, like someone had tapped the edge of a perfect glass and found a hairline crack. And then, later that afternoon, it happened. The simulation ran. Not just ran, it held. The model stabilized at exactly the range Emma had suggested. The heat thresholds aligned. The input-output ratios balanced for the first time in weeks. Cole stood in the corner of the lab, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, watching it cycle again and again with robotic perfection. Dr. Kim looked stunned. A few of the junior scientists exchanged glances, as if they were unsure whether to celebrate or check their math. And then, Dr. Mateo stepped forward, hands clasped loosely behind his back. "We've been going in circles for 3 weeks," he said, voice calm but firm, arguing over variables, complex adjustments, and flawed assumptions. He paused, then added, "Emma fixed it. Not you, not me. Her." Silence. A long, weighty silence. No one objected. No one clapped either. But that kind of stillness, the kind that stretches just long enough to become truth, was its own acknowledgement. Emma wasn't in the room to hear it. She was at her desk, typing out inventory forms and answering a question about lunch delivery for an upcoming seminar. She didn't need to hear it. But the next morning, as she passed by the break room, she caught something. 2 researchers young, both always too preoccupied to remember her name, were talking over coffee. "Did you hear about the model fix?" one asked. "Yeah." The other smirked. "Just a secretary." Huh. Emma didn't stop walking. She didn't turn around. But her chest tightened, not with embarrassment or even pride, but with something closer to quiet affirmation. She hadn't imagined it. And maybe she didn't belong in that room. Yet. But that room now knew she existed. The lab doors whispered shut behind her as she returned to her desk, her fingers poised above the keyboard. Outside, the wind picked up against the tall windows. And somewhere, deep inside the building's humming heart, the simulation continued to run quietly, steadily, almost like it had always known how. He invited her to dinner, not in a suit and tie way, but in the kind of way that left her wondering if she should even say yes. The invitation came without preamble. A short message, typed and sent via internal email. "Dinner, tonight, 7 p.m. DeLuca's on 5th. If you're available, C. Bennett." No subject line. No signature block. No explanation. Emma reread it 3 times, unsure if it was a mistake. Was this about the model fix, a gesture of gratitude, or something else entirely? She debated whether to go. She didn't have anything fancy to wear. Her nicest top was a soft navy blouse she kept for doctor appointments and job interviews. Still, something in her stomach twisted with nervous curiosity, and when the clock struck 6:15, she found herself brushing her hair and applying the lightest trace of lip color. DeLuca's was a quiet, understated place. Linen napkins, low lighting, the kind of restaurant that didn't boast, it just existed, in quiet confidence. Cole was already there when she arrived, seated in a corner booth beneath a wall lined with wine bottles. No tie, just a dark sweater over a crisp shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Relaxed, but unmistakably guarded. He stood as she approached, a brief nod replacing any form of greeting. She slid into the seat across from him, unsure where to place her hands. The menus were already folded on the table. A candle flickered between them, small and steady. "Thank you for coming," he said, finally breaking the silence. Emma gave a polite smile. "Thank you for inviting me." The waiter came and went. Water was poured, orders placed. Then the real conversation began, not loud, not probing, but deliberate, like walking a narrow trail with careful footing. He asked about her education. She spoke of the years she spent studying physics at a community college, and how life had rerouted her. She spoke of her father's sudden death, of a marriage that had promised more than it gave, and of the long nights spent holding her mother's hand during coughing fits that shook the walls. Cole listened, not with pity, but with something quieter, attentive, measured, When the plates arrived, untouched for a while, he spoke. "My wife's name was Adrienne," he said simply. "We met in grad school. She challenged every assumption I made me sharper, better. She was working late when the fire started. Gas leak. No one caught it in time. Emma looked down, her fork still untouched. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, not as if accepting sympathy, but acknowledging it as a fact, something filed neatly, like everything else in his life. "We built the lab together," he continued. "Every system, every safety check, we thought we'd covered everything. I spent a year afterward tearing it all down, looking for the mistake. There wasn't one. It was just bad luck." A long pause stretched between them. Emma took a sip of water to clear her throat. "I'm not sure what's harder, losing someone suddenly, or losing them slowly every day." He didn't ask what she meant. He seemed to know. The conversation wove in and out of quiet reflections and simple observations. They talked about small towns, Seattle's rain, her mother's fondness for crime dramas, and the way certain kinds of grief never really left. They just learned to sit quietly beside you. There was no flirtation, no romantic undercurrent, just understanding. And yet, something lingered beneath the surface, a tension unspoken, as if they both sensed a line neither wanted to name, much less cross. The twist came not with raised voices, but with soft defiance. At one point, as the plates were cleared and the final sips of coffee cooled, Cole leaned back and said, "You know, there's a place for someone like you here. Someone who sees what others don't." Emma didn't smile. "I'm not looking to be rescued," she said, her voice calm, but edged with something firmer. Cole met her eyes evenly. "I wasn't offering, it wasn't a rebuke, it wasn't a challenge, it was just honest." And in that moment, she believed him. They left the restaurant together, walking side by side down a quiet street glazed with city lights and distant car horns. The breeze tugged gently at her sleeve, the night cool and steady. Outside the parking structure, they paused. Emma turned to thank him again, unsure of what else to say. He extended his hand, not a hug, not a kiss on the cheek, just a handshake, firm, measured, exactly like him. But in that brief contact skin meeting, skin for a few unspoken seconds, something fluttered in her chest. Not a rush, not a storm, just one beat, out of rhythm. She got into her rideshare and didn't look back until the car turned the corner. Behind the tinted glass, Cole stood still under the streetlight, watching. She opened the email out of habit. She wasn't supposed to see it, but some truth burned even in silence. It was nearly 8 p.m. when Emma was still at her desk, long after most of the team had filtered out. The floor was quiet, save for the low hum of the HVAC system and the occasional rattle of the elevator echoing through the marble corridor. She was sorting through lab invoices and cross-checking inventory requests when her inbox pinged. Subject media strategy. Internal use only from C, Bennett to R, Quan, M, Levi. She clicked without thinking, assuming it was a scheduling note. Her job required her to filter a few of Cole's internal memos, and late emails weren't unusual. But this one wasn't meant for her. Her name wasn't on the list. She froze. Her eyes scanned the body of the message before her mind could decide whether or not it was right to keep reading. Given recent developments, we should consider maximizing the positive PR impact of Emma Whitaker's unexpected contribution. Media narratives around unlikely heroes test well with general audiences. Her background adds authenticity to the redemption arc. The press is craving. This could offset some of the skepticism about the delay. The board doesn't need the science, just the story. See. Emma sat back slowly. Her hands were still on the keyboard, but her body had gone very still. She stared at the screen until the words blurred, not from confusion, but from clarity too sharp to hold all at once. The silence around her felt different now, colder. For a few moments, she didn't move. She didn't rage, didn't cry, just sat, listening to the small creak of her own chair and the steady tick of the wall clock. She read the email again. The words weren't cruel. In fact, they were polished, professional, not a single insult, not a hint of mockery. But that made it worse. It wasn't anger, it was strategy. She wasn't a person in that message. She was a concept, a narrative, a temporary arc to cover a longer delay. And suddenly, the handshakes and nods and invitations to dinner, the softening of lines between two people who had shared grief in silence and almost understanding, felt hollow, or at least tainted. She closed the email, opened a new document, typed quietly, resignation letter, Emma Whitaker. She kept it simple, no emotion, no explanation, just 2 paragraphs and a signature. She printed it slowly, folded it neatly, slipped it into a manila envelope, and wrote his name across the front. Then she rose, took one last look at the neat little space she had tried to make her own, a potted plant near the window, the pen holder her mother had sent her in the mail, the notepad with formulas she never got to share, and she placed the envelope in the center of Cole's immaculate desk. By the time the night shift crew came in, Emma was gone. She walked out of the building without a sound. No dramatic pause at the elevator. No final glance over her shoulder. Just the soft tap of her boots on teal and the quiet hiss of the front doors parting for her one last time. Outside, the air was crisp, and the city lights cast long reflections across the glass buildings around her. She pulled her coat tighter, opened her phone, and booked a late ride to the train station. Then she opened her airline app and used the last of her emergency savings to buy a one-way ticket back to Montana. The woman at the ticket counter asked if she had any luggage. Emma shook her head. "No," she said, "just me." Hours later, Cole returned to his office, worn and tired from a late call with investors. His tie was loosened, his steps slower than usual. He noticed the envelope before he reached his chair. At first, he thought it was a document drop-off, but then he saw the handwriting tight, clean, unmistakably Emma's. And as he opened it, something in his chest shifted before his brain caught up. When he finished reading, he didn't say a word, didn't sit, didn't call anyone, didn't run after her. He simply stood there, in the middle of the office, with the envelope still in his hand, and looked at the empty space beyond the glass. The space where her desk used to be. The plant was still there. The notepad, but the seat was empty, and it felt wrong. He looked down at the letter again. No anger, no demand, no accusations, just distance. And like the way she'd arrived quiet, unnoticed, tucked between meetings and missed coffee orders, Emma left without fanfare. But this time, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something had been lost. And this time, no one could fix it with a model or a formula. The mountains didn't ask questions. They just stood still and let her breathe. Snow fell in soft, uneven patterns as the Greyhound rolled into Milesburg. Not the heavy, cinematic kind of snow, just enough to hush the roads and dust the roofs like powdered sugar over a tired town. Emma stepped off the bus with nothing but her coat, her canvas bag, and a silence that had settled somewhere deep inside her, like a stone she didn't know how to dislodge. The same cracked sidewalk met her boots. The same bent street sign leaned against the hardware store, like it had since she was 16. Time hadn't stopped here. It had simply wandered off and circled back. Waiting for her in the gravel lot was a beat-up green pickup that coughed more than it purred. Behind the wheel, her mother sat bundled in a coat too large and a scarf too bright, her eyes tired but alert, searching Emma's face before the engine even shut off. The door opened with a familiar creak. "Hi, Ma." Her mother reached over and pulled her into a one-armed hug, oxygen tube tucked awkwardly against her cheek. "Hi, baby? You cold?" Emma shook her head, though she was. But it wasn't the weather. They didn't talk much on the drive home. Milesburg didn't require conversation. It spoke in familiar turns and potholes that hadn't been fixed since before the last mayor's re-election. Her mother hummed softly to an old Patsy Cline tune, hands steady on the wheel, as if her daughter's return didn't carry the weight of unspoken things. The house looked smaller than Emma remembered, or maybe she had grown not in height, but in the quiet ways one does after disappointment. She stepped back into the place she had left with such trembling hope only a few weeks before. Nothing had changed. The kitchen still smelled like lavender and lemon. The heater still clicked 3 times before blowing warm air. Her old room, down the hall and second on the left, still had the faded quilt folded at the end of the bed. She set her bag down, sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs gave a soft groan. Outside, snow began to stick to the windows. The next few days unfolded like a slow, familiar song. Emma swept the porch, folded towels, restocked pill bottles. She didn't speak of Seattle, and her mother didn't ask, not directly, only once, while stirring a pot of soup. She glanced over and asked, "You tired?" Emma nodded, a little, and that was enough. One morning, while digging through the old bookshelf in the hallway, she came across a cardboard box marked College, Physics. She hadn't opened it in years. Maybe she had avoided it. Maybe she had forgotten it was even there. Inside, tucked between battered notebooks and loose handouts, was the leather-bound journal she'd carried everywhere in those early semesters. The corners were worn, the pages dog-eared and faded, but her handwriting was still clear, precise, blocky, full of confidence she no longer recognized as her own. She sat cross-legged on the carpet and flipped through the pages, formulas, diagrams, side notes in red pen, ideas written in the margins like conversations with a version of herself that hadn't yet learned to shrink. Then, midway through the book, she stopped. There, sketched in pencil and half-finished, was a schematic and energy transfer model, hand-drawn with annotations and a few question marks scrawled in the corners. Her breath caught. She knew that shape, not exactly, but nearly, the curvature, the flow logic, the thermal buffer layout. It looked almost like the prototype they'd been building in Seattle. Her fingers hovered above the page. She wasn't accusing. She wasn't doubting. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about belonging. She had drawn this years ago, not polished, not perfect, but the idea the seed had been there, long before titles, before labs, before anyone told her what she wasn't allowed to be. And suddenly, the shame she had carried from that email, the feeling of being used began to shift. She hadn't been given a role in Seattle. She had carved it. She had earned it. Tears came then, not with force, but like quiet guests at the edge of her vision. She wiped them away with the sleeve of her sweater and let her shoulders shake, just once. When the tears passed, she didn't close the notebook. Instead, she reached for the pencil that had rolled beside the baseboard, and slowly, carefully, she began to draw, not from memory, but from instinct, completing lines that had waited years to be finished, curving equations like brushstrokes, answering questions she once thought she wasn't allowed to ask. Outside, the snow was still falling. The wind pressed softly against the walls, as if to say, "You're home now?" But inside, something had changed. Not just the air, not just the silence. Emma was back in Montana, but more importantly, she was back to herself. He had built empires on logic, but no formula could tell him why her absence felt like failure. The office had never been noisy, but now it felt hollow. Cole sat at his desk, surrounded by perfect order files labeled, screens quiet, blinds drawn in their usual crisp alignment, and yet the air felt off, like a note slightly out of tune. It had been 10 days since Emma left. No confrontation, no email, no explanations, save for the neat letter on his desk. He hadn't shared it with anyone. He hadn't answered questions either. The others assumed she'd moved on. Temporary staff always did. But Cole knew better. He didn't delete her file from the system. He didn't reassign her desk. He didn't even remove the notepad with her looping handwriting still etched faintly across the top page. Inventory notes? A tiny sketch of a thermodynamic curve. A quote scribbled in pencil. Simplicity is just complexity resolved. She hadn't signed it, but he knew it was hers. At night, he stayed longer in the lab, not for the work, but for the quiet. It offered the kind that didn't ask questions, but gave space to the ones he couldn't yet answer. And in those late hours, when the building was emptied of its brilliance and buzz, Cole opened old files, not the big presentations or patent drafts, the notes, the messy, margin-filled, version history documents that passed through Emma's hands before reaching final form. He began to notice things he hadn't before, tiny corrections, not obvious, not even stated, just fixed, a mislabeled axis, a temperature tolerance decimal shifted half a place, a scribbled circle in pencil around a flawed assumption. He followed the trail back to the simulation logs, and there it was, her handwriting quiet, clean, unobtrusive in the margins of a printed schematic. Should this be inverted? 3 words, a question, not an assertion. But that question had changed the model's trajectory, and he hadn't noticed. Or worse, he had, but dismissed it because of who it came from. The realization didn't come like a thunderclap. It came like insomnia, creeping, steady, and impossible to ignore. That night, Cole poured himself a glass of scotch and sat alone in his apartment. The city skyline, a pale blur through the frost-glazed windows. The silence pressed around him, not peaceful, but loaded. He opened his laptop again. That email, the one that changed everything, still sat in his sent folder. He read it slowly this time, not as the man who wrote it, but as the woman who had received it. Her background adds authenticity to the redemption arc, media narratives around unlikely heroes. The board doesn't need the science, just the story. His own words stared back at him like strangers. It hadn't been meant cruelly. He hadn't lied. But he'd told the truth in a way that reduced her, not a person, a symbol, and symbols don't stay. He called Matteo near midnight. The older man answered on the second ring, voice groggy but not annoyed. "Cole, I need to ask you something," Cole said. His voice was lower than usual, heavier. "Go ahead." There was a long pause. Cole rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. "If I was wrong about her, not just about what she could do, but about who she is, what does that make me?" Matteo was silent for a moment. Then, gently, "It makes you human." "That's not good enough?" "Maybe not," Matteo said, his voice tightening. "But here's what I think. You weren't wrong about her. Cole, you just weren't brave enough to be right about her." The line hung between them. Cole stared at the floor. Words caught somewhere between his chest and throat. "I saw her," he said finally. "I mean, I thought I did. You saw her mind, maybe even her pain. But did you see her worth without needing it to serve something else?" Another silence. Then Matteo's voice softened. "You let her become a statistic in your story." But she was writing her own. The next morning, Cole arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sky was still blue-gray with dawn, the city half asleep. He didn't open his computer. He didn't check his calendar. He pulled out his phone, opened a travel app, and searched for one word: Milesburg, 1 flight, 2 layovers, a rental car. He booked it without hesitation. No itinerary, no agenda, no press release to manage, just the gnawing weight of something unfinished. And this time, he wouldn't try to explain it with data. He didn't expect her to open the door, but her mother did and served him soup. The drive into Milesburg was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned, like the land had settled into itself and decided it didn't need to explain anything to anyone anymore. Cole hadn't told anyone he was coming. Not the board, not Matteo, not even his assistant. He just left. Booked the flights, took the car, drove north on roads that narrowed with snow and memory. The town was smaller than he'd imagined, but somehow bigger in presence, as if it expanded to fit the weight of the people who had stayed behind. He didn't use GPS to find her house. He didn't need to. There was something intuitive about the way he turned onto Maple Street and slowed in front of a pale green house with chipped paint on the shutters and a crooked mailbox shaped like a chicken. It felt like the kind of place where something important had begun. The engine cut off with a final sigh. He sat for a moment, watching his breath fog the windshield, hands resting on the steering wheel like he was still trying to decide whether or not to knock. But before he could, the front door creaked open. Emma's mother stood there, wrapped in a thick cardigan and a fleece blanket draped over one shoulder like a shawl. Her oxygen tube rested delicately beneath her nose, but her eyes were sharp, familiar. She didn't look surprised. "You came all this way," she said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. Cole cleared his throat. "Yes." "Ma'am?" She studied him for a moment longer, then stepped aside. "Well," she said, "it's too cold to stand there. Come in, I'll get you some soup." Emma wasn't in the house. "She's out back, clearing the walkway," her mother explained, as she handed Cole a bowl of something warm that smelled like rosemary and chicken broth. "She likes the quiet out there, helps her think." He nodded. The spoon clinked gently against the bowl as he stirred without eating. The house was simple, lived in. Quilts on the arm of the sofa, old frame photos along the walls. The kind of kitchen where the drawer handles didn't match, but each one had a history. He sat at the table, unsure of what to say. Her mother didn't push conversation, just sat across from him, sipping her own bowl in silence, as though they were two old friends with nothing urgent to resolve. When they finished, she stood and disappeared down the hallway, returned with a manila folder, edges worn soft with age. "She never shows this to anyone," she said, voice low but steady. "But I think you ought to see it." Cole took the folder gently, hands suddenly careful. Inside were pages of notes sketched in pencil, marked with highlighter, some stained with old coffee rings, or teardrop-shaped warps in the paper, hand-drawn models, early energy conversion ideas, graphs, annotations, thought experiments. The handwriting was younger, slightly uneven in places, but the ideas, they were there, the bones of something brilliant. A line caught his eye, scribbled at the top of one page. "Energy doesn't disappear, it waits." He closed the folder slowly, pressing it with both palms as if the heat from his hands might apologize. She was 19 when she drew most of that, her mother said. Didn't think anyone would care. Cole nodded, throat thick. She didn't solve it in a moment, he whispered. She'd been solving it for years. Just then, the back door creaked, boots scuffed against the entry mat. The soft thud of a shovel leaning against the porch rail. A gust of winter air followed her in, and then Emma stepped into the kitchen. For a moment, she didn't see him. She unwrapped her scarf, shook snow from her sleeves, wiped her boots. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her hair loosely tied back, and when she finally looked up, their eyes met. She didn't speak, neither did he, but something shifted in the room. Not tension, not relief, just recognition. She saw the folder, saw his hand resting on it gently, thumb pressed against the edge like he was afraid it might disappear. Their eyes held for a long time. She didn't demand an explanation. He didn't offer one. There were no accusations, no apologies shaped into words too late. Just that one look shared between two people who had both walked into silence, and somehow, into understanding. Emma's mother, sensing something she didn't need to interrupt, stood and quietly left the room. A few moments later, they heard her turn on the old radio in the den, soft country music drifting down the hallway. Back in the kitchen, 2 mugs sat on the table, steam curling into the air from forgotten tea. Cole reached for one, but didn't lift it. His fingers tapped once, then stilled. Emma sat down across from him. No one stood up. No one explained the silence. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, time softened, and between them, a space opened not wide, but enough. Just enough. Houston was hot, loud, and dazzling, but he couldn't stop looking at the empty chair beside him. The ballroom at the Westin Grand was packed wall to wall. Scientists, CEOs, policy advisors, tech investors, media crews. Bright lights poured over the stage, bouncing off polished microphones and corporate banners. Cole Bennett stood center stage with the new prototype diagram behind him, sleek, refined, and complete. The energy model had finally passed every test, each component working in harmony. It was, by every measurable standard, a success. But success had never felt so quiet. He adjusted the mic and took a slow breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady, clear. "What you see behind me is the result of years of research, countless hours of failure, and one single moment of clarity." A murmur rippled across the room. Cole ignored the teleprompter. His team had prepared a full speech, full of numbers and impact statements, but he wasn't going to read it, not today. What changed everything, he continued, was not a breakthrough in the lab, but a moment in a hallway. A question, written in pencil, next to a coffee stain on the corner of a draft no one else had even looked at twice. A few audience members chuckled politely, unsure if it was meant to be humorous. Cole didn't smile. There's a temptation in this field to chase complexity. We equate layers with intelligence. We chase abstraction and reward opacity. But the solution to this model wasn't complex. It was beautiful in its simplicity. And someone without a title, without a Ph.D., someone who wasn't even supposed to be in the room, reminded me what clarity looks like. The screen behind him shifted to a simulation, run graceful arcs, clean transitions, a perfect loop of captured and redistributed energy. He let the room settle, let the silence stretch a moment longer than expected. Then, someone raised a hand from the third row. A woman in a navy suit, notebook poised. "Mr. Bennett," she asked, "can you share the name of this mysterious co-developer?" Cole paused. A beat, then another, and in that space, his eyes drifted toward the chair to his right, reserved, respectfully, with her name never printed on the card. He looked back at the crowd. "No," he said quietly. "I can't." The audience stilled. "She's not here," he continued, voice low but clear. "But I hope she hears this." Meanwhile, in Milesburg, the living room was dim, lit only by the television's soft blue glow and the quiet tick of a wall clock long overdue for repair. Emma sat curled on the couch, a blanket draped across her legs, a chipped mug of tea cooling on the side table. She hadn't planned to watch it, but when a friend texted, "Your guy's on CNN," curiosity overruled caution. She watched him walk on stage in a crisp gray suit, watched the camera zoom in on his face, eyes tired but calm. He looked older than when he left, not in years, in weight. His voice filled the room, and with each word, something tightened beneath her ribs. He didn't mention her name. He didn't need to. She recognized every pause, every careful sentence, every unsaid thing. And when the woman asked the question, Emma didn't breathe, not until he answered, "She's not here, but I hope she hears this." Her chest rose and fell with something between a sigh and a release. She didn't finish watching the segment, didn't wait for applause or closing remarks. She reached for the remote and turned off the TV with a soft click. The room returned to stillness. Outside, the wind moved gently through the pine trees. The house creaked in its old, familiar ways. Her tea was cold now, untouched, but she didn't mind, because something in her felt acknowledged, not fixed, not erased, but seen. And that was enough for now. She stood, stretched slowly, and carried the mug to the sink, rinsed it, placed it upside down on the drying rack. Her mother's radio was on in the background, humming some tune about long roads and second chances. Emma stood there for a moment longer, fingers still wet from the rinse, and allowed herself a small smile. Not the kind meant for anyone else. Just for her. Her name had never been on a building before. Now it stood in bronze letters on a glass wall. The new wing of the Bennett Research Center gleamed in late spring sunlight, glass panels polished to a shine. Steel beams curved like open arms. Outside, a modest crowd gathered beneath white tents and swaying banners that read, "The Whitaker Fellowship Launch Ceremony." Emma stood near the edge of the crowd, clutching a simple linen program with trembling fingers. Her name was on the cover, printed in elegant serif font, but her role wasn't listed. Just her name, no title, no biography, just Emma Whitaker. It made her chest feel both proud and small at the same time. She wasn't used to being seen. Not like this. Inside. The auditorium buzzed with soft conversation. Students, educators, donors, local journalists. They filled the rows in business casual and weekend best, exchanging hopeful chatter about opportunity and change. Emma took a seat in the front row, not by choice, but because someone with a clipboard had ushered her there insistently. She sat between a young woman in her early 20s, clutching a spiral notebook like it was armor, and an older man who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and aftershave. The lights dimmed. A violin played softly over the speakers. Then, a single spotlight lit up the podium. Cole walked out in a navy suit, more relaxed than she'd seen him in Houston, but his posture still straight, voice still measured. "Thank you all for being here," he began, eyes scanning the room. "Today is not just about a fellowship. It's about recognizing value where others might not think to look." He paused. Let the words settle. In science, we've built too many gates. And in doing so, we've left brilliance on the other side uninvited. Emma sat very still. This fellowship is for the women who were told they needed more letters after their name, instead of someone asking them better questions. Soft laughter, nods from across the room. Cole continued, "The Whitaker Fellowship exists because someone, once, saw a solution where others only saw her job title. She wasn't in the room to impress. She was there to serve coffee. And yet, she changed the trajectory of a problem we had been stuck on for months." He didn't look at Emma, but he didn't need to. Her name wasn't on any publications. She didn't sign the patents. She left before the press releases. But she left something else: clarity. The kind that comes from living close to the ground and thinking deeply when no one's watching. The screen behind him lit up. A photograph faded in, taken from behind, slightly blurred, of Emma at her old desk, head down, pencil in hand. Then, her name appeared beneath it, Emma Whitaker. Nothing else, and the room erupted in applause. Not polite, not brief, but full, sustained, the kind of applause that doesn't just celebrate but recognizes. Emma felt the pressure build behind her eyes. She hadn't cried in public in years. She gripped the edges of the program, knuckles white, then slowly released her hands and let them fall to her lap. Her breath came out shaky, but controlled. When the clapping faded, Cole returned to the microphone. "I couldn't give her the credit she deserved then," he said, softer now. "I hope I'm doing better now." Then he stepped back from the podium, and for a long second, the spotlight just hovered. After the ceremony, people approached her. Students asked about her favorite books. Mothers thanked her for being visible. Someone wanted a photo. Someone else handed her a handwritten letter. Emma smiled, nodded, spoke gently, but it wasn't until she slipped away, wandered down the hallway of the new wing, that she found a moment to herself. Near the far end, where sunlight spilled through floor-to-ceiling glass, there it was. A plaque, simple, elegant, mounted beside the door of a small lab space. The Whitaker Fellowship Lab, and below that, a space for curious minds. No degree required. Her fingers brushed the cool metal letters. Not disbelief, not pride, just stillness. Outside, laughter echoed from the courtyard. A student recited her name into a phone. Someone took a selfie in front of the banner. But inside, Emma stood alone with the plaque, not as a guest, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had been invisible and was now known. She didn't need to say anything. The bronze had already said enough. He didn't offer a ring. He offered something heavier, a place beside him, not behind. The guests had all gone. The banners had been folded, and the stage lights powered down to soft amber. Somewhere in the distance, a janitor's mop echoed gently in an empty hallway. The building, moments ago filled with applause and camera shutters, had fallen into a hush. Emma stood alone on the balcony of the research wing, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in her hand. Below, the parking lot glimmered with taillights fading one by one into the spring dusk. She didn't hear him approach, but she knew it was him. Cole stepped up beside her, leaving just enough space to feel respectful, but close enough that their silhouettes overlapped in the glass window's reflection. "I thought you might need air," he said. Emma smiled softly, eyes still on the horizon. "I needed quiet." He nodded. That too. A beat of silence stretched between them. Comfortable now. Familiar? "I have something for you," he said, reaching into the inner pocket of his blazer. She turned, just slightly. Not a ring box, not velvet, not gold. A simple manila envelope. He held it out like a peace offering. She took it without a word and opened it. Inside was a formal document, printed neatly on Bennett Energy Solutions letterhead. The title at the top made her throat tighten. Offer of Appointment Director of Community Innovation. Her name sat below it. Emma Whitaker. Nothing added, nothing taken away. She skimmed the details: flexible location, research freedom, no dress code, mentorship of fellowship recipients, the authority to start projects that bridge science and lived experience. She reached the last page, a single line in Cole's handwriting. "For the one who taught me simplicity is the highest form of brilliance." The tears didn't fall all at once, just one, then another, not from pride, not from victory, but from recognition. This wasn't a favor. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a headline. It was a seat at the table, one built for her, not shaped around her, not repainted or borrowed, hers. She folded the papers neatly, pressed the envelope to her chest, and exhaled. Then she looked at him, fully. "What if I say no?" she asked quietly. Cole didn't flinch. He smiled, genuinely, a little sad, a little hopeful. "Then I'll still be proud to have known you," he said. There was no bargaining in his voice, no pressure, just truth. And in that moment, Emma felt something inside her shift, not because he wanted her, but because he respected her. That made all the difference. She didn't answer right away, not with words. She didn't have to. They stood like that a while longer, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch across the parking lot, pooling between the parked cars like liquid gold. Then, together. They turned and walked back through the double doors. They didn't hold hands. They didn't kiss. They didn't say finally or at last. But people in the hallway staff, students, custodians looked up as they passed. And somehow, everyone knew. This wasn't the beginning of something romantic. It was the continuation of something real. Two people, side by side. Not because they had to be, but because they chose to be. Later that evening, as the building dimmed and the world turned quieter still, Emma sat at the empty desk in the small office reserved for the new director. She placed the envelope on the table. Next to it, she laid her old notebook. The cover was worn now, corners curled, the spine barely hanging on. But inside, the pages still whispered with ideas, unfinished sketches, handwritten equations, fragments of a girl who had once dreamed in silence. She opened to a blank page, picked up a pen, and began to write, not for approval, not for correction, not even for proof, but for herself. Because for the first time in her life, she belonged exactly where she was, and she didn't need a ring to prove it. Sometimes, the most brilliant minds are not the loudest voices in the room. They're the quiet ones, observing from the sidelines, waiting for a moment to offer something real. Emma Whitaker's story reminds us that value isn't measured by titles, degrees, or status. It's found in character, in quiet resilience, in the ability to see clearly when others are blinded by noise. In a world obsessed with credentials and appearances, we often forget to look deeper to notice the wisdom in unlikely places. How many Emmas have we overlooked in our own lives? How many truths have gone unheard because they came in simple packaging? This story isn't just about science or success. It's about the power of being seen and the courage it takes to walk away when you're not. And maybe, most importantly, it's about this. When someone finally recognizes your worth, Let it be the confirmation, not the source of your value, because you've always had it, even in silence. Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it touched your heart, made you pause, or reminded you of someone you once knew, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Shining Stories. Your support helps us keep telling quiet stories that speak loudly to the soul. We can't wait to share the next one with you.